tooth. The doctrine she voices is certainly to be found in the Gospels. Quotes, "Love ye your enemies, be ye therefore merciful, as your Father is merciful." Luke 6:35. Here the reason for avoiding retaliatory justice is that justice is simply transcended by mercy, as Portia explained. But the passage in Luke continues, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." Suddenly we are given another reason. Justice belongs to the Father, not to you. If you usurp his place, substitute yourself for him, he may not be so merciful after all. He may judge you. Again, it's a little glimpse, but I think the voice of Shakespeare is connected to the resonance at the mind of the soul of Britain, and I think it's being tried and tested at the moment by this wave of anti-European hysteria that swept over our country through false memes, social media. We know it was from Russian and American sources both. I mean, interfering in our democratic well-being as a country, threatening the stability of the United Kingdom. I mean, Shakespeare's turning in his grave at all this. I'm not a Shakespearean scholar, but I know enough about Shakespeare to know he would oppose Brexit and all that it stands for, this petty, narrow English nationalism. Talking of which, I want to move on to some of the earliest Welsh poetry that's come down. I lived for 10 years in Wales when I was living in Montgomery, which is in Wales. And I then moved to Llanerfel, which is a beautiful remote village in Powys. And I communed with the whole Druid tradition. I wrote a lot of bardic poetry myself. I used to organise Druid retreats, and I was also teaching religious studies in schools in Wales. And, I fell in love with the bardic traditions of the ancient British Druid traditions. And these are some of the earliest that have come down to us. Those are the Triads of Britain. They're in the version compiled by Iolo Morgannwg, who was one of the refounders of Druidry, who was inspired by a still living oral tradition, tramping around Wales. He was an extraordinary man, self-educated. He never went to university, but he was fluent in Welsh, and he compiled these anthologies, and Geraint Davies and other scholars have said, okay, he augmented them, he embellished them. Well, it may be. I don't think that should be called forgery. It's more, he was intuitively downloading extra bits to the oral traditions that he knew. He was himself a poet and a bard. And I think, we're entitled to do that. The Triads, from which I'm reading, the Triads of Britain, are immemorial ancient Druid teaching devices. So they used to think in threes. Druidry is about threeness, and it sees everything in threes. And I've written about this in my book on religious mathematics. Why threes? Well, threes are very, very important, and they represent the triangle. They represent how from the unity comes the duality, and then from that comes, the son, the daughter, the offspring. They represent life. And we have the tricolour in France. The flag has three elements to it, and many flags in the world copied the tricolour. And the people that devised the tricolour were also inspired by Druidry. And so was the Christian Trinity idea, that God himself comes as a threesome was a very ancient Gallic idea, inspired partly by Druid sources. And you can grumble and say, no, God's just an absolute unity. But the thing is that the unity, the one, gives birth to manyness. And just as you need, you have the number one, you couldn't have mathematics with just one. You need 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So you need all the other numbers which come from the one. And they contain the unity within them, but they then amplify that unity. And threeness is breaking through the binary duality of yin-yang. Two-ness, which is wonderful. Two-ness is the beginning of all number, but the three is when the next level manifests. Anyway, the Druids and threesomeness go back a very long way. I've written about this in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies. Here's just a little flavour of this book of Triads. The three renowned astronomers of the Isle of Britain, Idris, the giant, Gwydion, son of Donne, and Gwyn, son of Nudd. Such was their knowledge of the stars, their natures and qualities, that they could prognosticate whatever was wished to be known unto the day of doom. The three beautiful maids of the Isle of Britain. Gwen, daughter of Cwrwydd, son of Cridon. Cernwy, daughter of Cenedwen. And Arian Rod, daughter of Donne. The three arrogant ones of the Isle of Britain. Saul, the lofty-headed, Pasgen, the son of Urien, and Run, the son of Einyaun. Their arrogance was most arrogant above every other arrogant thing, by means of which they brought anarchy in the Isle of Britain. And those who were influenced by this anarchy united with the Saxons, and finally became Saxons. You know, that's a very interesting little three triads I've read. The last one about arrogance is, I think, particularly relevant now, because to me Brexit, the Boris Johnson Conservative government, symbolises this arrogance in raw, naked form. The arrogance of every single member of his cabinet. And they have this sort of feeling that there's nothing you can do about it, that they're above all law, above all dharma, above all cosmic retribution, above all justice. Because they have their little fake referendum result, which was a fake, you know, and yet because they've manipulated the court system and parliament, they've put themselves, they think, in an invulnerable position. And because they're receiving great funding from forces that wish to destabilise and destroy Britain, they've received enormous amounts of money from Russian billionaires. They've received sources of money from other foreign interest groups who wish to destabilise Britain. And because they've managed to hijack the court system, they conceal this. During the pandemic, they've been giving away money to scurrilous and illegal companies for non-existing supplies and resources to fight the pandemic. I mean, it's as if a criminal mafia have taken over Britain. And I think actually that's what's happened. What I noted recently is that the Conservative Party constitution has nothing about values, ethics, or principles or values in them. Their constitution is completely void when it comes to that. All the other parties have online, you know, this is what we stand for. Various forms of democracy or liberty or equality or progress or whatever, or the environment or peace. The Liberal Democrat manifesto is brilliant on all this stuff. The Labour Party as well, and the others. But the Conservative Party has no mention of values whatsoever that I can find. I found their 2009 constitution for the Conservative Party, and it has no mention of any actual substance to any values they believe in. They seem to believe in lying, deceit, megalomania, control, and self-aggrandizement, which is the formula of arrogance. Even Dominic Cummings has now backed off and realised he made a catastrophic mistake in supporting Vote Leave. Now it's interesting he did that coming back from Russia. I think he'd been brainwashed in Russia. I don't go so far as to say he'd been recruited to Russian intelligence. No, you don't have to do that. He was influenced by the Russian kind of narrative, which is pretty paranoid and pretty anti-Western, and sadly, and I say that with grief because I love Russia. I love Russian history and Russian people. You know, I count some amazing Russians as my friends, and I'm honoured to know them, but collectively they've done a sort of funny nosedive since the ending of their social democratic communist system under Gorbachev. What happened has been a catastrophe, and I lament the passing of Gorbachev. I think he's still with us, by the way, and still active intellectually. He was a great man compared to what we have now. I mean, Putin is intelligent. He was an intelligence agent, and he's therefore permeated the whole of the Russian higher echelons with a sort of intelligence spin on things, which is dissembling and dangerous. And it's now come out in the media that there was a very high-level decision taken by Russian intelligence to plant Trump into power because he was recognised to be a destabilising force. He would help split up America. And that, was published in The Guardian a few days ago. Shocking stuff. Also recently a report on the extent to which the Conservative Party had been funded by Russia. I mean, what we thought we had as a robust constitution protecting and safeguarding democracy has been subverted through corruption, bribery, and this mafia sort of approach. And how we fight it, well, a mixture of Druidry, truth-telling, Dharma-seeing, poetics, applied poetics, and through fair and transparent and rational means. I'm a believer that, the inherent goodness in the British people as en masse, and I include the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish, and the English, will eventually realise they've been fooled and they'll reverse this. What's interesting about this triad is that it was the catastrophe of the arrogance of the British leaders that let in the Saxon mercenaries, who then began to take over the country, and who didn't play by the same ethical rules. The Saxons were pretty voracious and cruel to begin with, and that's what Arthur had to deal with. In the Arthurian legends, Arthur was the Welsh leader who fought these Saxons to a standstill and bought time, which enabled the Welsh to then survive and ultimately to Christianise the Saxons, i.e. to teach them some basic ethics and spirituality. Not that they didn't have it already. They had their runes, they had their pagan cosmology, and that runic knowledge is very sophisticated. I have a lot of time for it. I'm a rune practitioner. But it needed to be contextualised and backed up by the Christian wisdom and the Druid traditions, because a lot of the Druids had become Christian by then, because they recognised in Christ a great seer, a great Druid, effectively, as St. Columba said. So, gosh, we're still trying to civilise the Saxons, apparently. The work carries on. Thank you, Yolo Morganug. I want to read another of my poems now from my sort of middle period. I've written altogether 1,000 poems, And yeah, you know, it's still ongoing, but I'm going to read a poem called "The Secret of Life." This is from about 2008. I've always wanted to know the secret of life. That's why I, you know, became a philosopher. I wanted to study the secret of life. That's why I read the whole works of Plato and all the other great philosophers of history. I still want to know the secret of life. I think it can sometimes be expressed better in poetry than in scientific formula or mathematical algorithms. And this is a poem. It's called "The Secret of Life." I'm giving away the secret here. The one likes relationships and their bifurcations and trifurcations, and so on to infinity. The secret of life is relationships. The one becoming many in order to experience the endless delights of relationships. Therefore treat all beings as you would yourself, for you are one with everyone. They are not other than you. You descend from the same source, the same ultimate unity. And where does the one come from? The one comes from the womb, the emptiness, the stillness, the silence, the all numbers, the infinite, the void, the shunyata, the divine nothingness, the womb of space, primordial akash, which is what enables form to be, which is the infinite light source of dazzling darkness, which is the infinite 0-point energy source beyond comprehension. Some call it Tao. Some liken it to the innermost place of the secrets of the gods, the sublime Olympus, where space astounds on all sides, azure blue, and white-capped peaks probe her, awesome in majesty, giving life, from where the fertility of lightning thunders down into the plains. I want to say a little bit about that image of Olympus and Greece. As you know probably from my work, I'm a great fan of classical civilization and culture, and in the 1990s a friend of mine, Dr. Carl Shapley, who was a great seer sage, he was the son of Harlow Shapley, who'd been an astronomer at Harvard University and a friend of Einstein and Roosevelt. Carl was a sort of son of Harlow that wanted to bring metaphysics and spirituality into the study of science. He set up the New World Academy and appointed me Vice-Chancellor. And he went to the founding of the, in Moscow in 1990, of the new Delphic Games. And he came back from that to London and gave me all the bump and said, "Thomas, this is fantastic. You know, we are refounding the Delphic Games." And I watched their progress on and off since then. They've had a few international games. They've had some youth games. They've never broken through into the popular mind as the Olympic Games are. They're sort of known about only in a small circle, sadly. And why are the Delphic Games important? Because they were the place where the poets of the classical world used to come together and compete every 4 years with as much seriousness and as much importance as the athletes did at Olympus. Not only poets, but musicians, dancers, theatre performances, Pindar used to go and write poems in honour of the people that were contesting. And also they would practice rhetoric, public oratory, speaking skills. All the, let's call it the intellectual arts, were performed at Delphi every 4 years for nearly 1,000 years. And yet we are not taught this in our history books. We're not taught this unless we become classical scholars. And we're not taught it in the public media. You know, the Olympic Games are now well established. They're famous, they're great, everyone loves them. I look back on the 2012 Olympics in Britain and they were fond, extraordinary event. And the ones that are going on in Japan, I wish them well. I hope they really are a boost to the planet's collective heartbeat. We need it. But I want the Delphic Games to be as popular, as important, and as celebrated as the Olympic Games. Delphi was the centre of Apollo. He was the deity of inspiration, prophecy, and healing. Asclepius, his son, was the founder of medical traditions in Greece. And if you go to Kos, where Hippocrates set up the Asclepiad, you know, these temples of healing were all over the classical world. The Greeks and the Druids are very close, and the Druids knew about the need to heal from within as well as externally. And Apollo is the deity of that spiritual transformation. So Delphi has huge significance for me. I've been there. I've loved Delphi ever since I first heard about it. You know, as a boy reading classical tales in Brighton growing up, possibly even in Montreal I might have heard of Delphi, and only later did I discover about the Delphic Games. Anyway, what's now exciting I can report is that now I'm helping with the core group that are trying to advance the Delphic Games, and I'm delighted to be in this room, Thalia, the muse of literature and poetry, because in a sense we're calling for all the poets of the world to get involved. Let's make the Delphic Games as important, as famous, as awesomely extraordinary as the Olympic Games. And let's prove to the world that mankind isn't only about physical prowess. As much as I admire the athletes that can leap and twirl around the bars and run, you know, huge marathons and great swimming races and so on, that's fantastic. But I think the intellectual athletes of the planet are as important, perhaps even more so, because without the dramatists, without the Shakespeares, without the Pindars, without the Platos and the Homers, without the Zbiegnew Herbert and the Dylan Thomases and so on, our society is doomed. We'll become a society of just robot, fifth generation IT specialists that know everything, have infinite access to information, but don't know the value and the meaning of anything. That's what art does. Art gives birth to that mind in the soul that Donne talks about. And so that's why I'm supporting the Delphic Games. I'm helping with particularly with their educational outreach. And if anyone wants to be involved in that, please get in touch. Our Secretary General lives in Berlin, and there are great plans afoot. Now I want to move to another great poet. I'm going to read from an English poet who was from Nottinghamshire, and when I taught for 2 years in a wonderful school in Sherwood Forest, I would pass by on my way to work from Nottingham City the abbey that Lord Byron had grown up in. It's now, there's a kind of museum you can go into. And Byron was an extraordinary figure. He was like the first pop star among poets. If the Delphic Games had been going in his day, he would have won every prize, you know, for a few years running. Because he was like a real performer, a superstar. And you've got to think back, before the internet, before movies, before any of that stuff, before telephones, television, there was only the spoken and the written word. And when Byron's poems came out, you know, everyone wanted to read them. This is just a tiny glimpse from Don Juan, his great poem about love. "You take things coolly, sir," said Juan. "Why?" replied the other. "What can a man do? There still are many rainbows in your sky, but mine have vanished. All, when life is new, commence with feelings warm and prospects high, but time strips our illusions of their hue, and one by one in turn, some grand mistake casts off its bright skin yearly, like the snake." Tiny glimpse of his, his infinite sea of verse. I want to move to a Welsh poet. I've invoked the spirit of Wales and the Druids and the Bards. To me, Dylan Thomas was a 20th century bard. He had an amazing ability with language, and I used to spend Christmases on the Gower, which is close to Swansea, where he lived. And he was a great poet, was old Dylan. This is called "This Side of the Truth" for Llewellyn. "This side of the truth you may not see, my son, king of your blue eyes, in the blinding country of youth, that all is undone, under the unminding skies of innocence and guilt, before you make to move one gesture of the head or heart is gathered and spilt into the winding dark, like the dust of the dead. Good and bad, two ways of moving about your death by the grinding sea. King of your heart in the blind days, blow away like breath, go crying through you and me and the souls of all men into the innocent dark, and the guilty dark, and good death and bad death, and then, in the last element, fly like the star's blood, like the sun's tears, like the moon's seed, rubbish and fire, the flying rant of the sky, king of your 6 years, and the wicked wish, down the beginning of plants and animals and birds, water and light, the earth and sky, is cast before you move, and all your deeds and words, each truth, each lie, die in unjudging love. Thank you for Dylan Thomas's work, an amazing poet. I want to read now a poem from Goethe, who obviously was the Shakespeare of German literature, really, one of the great masters of European literature and poetry, and also drama. And I've studied his life and teachings, ever since I worked at the Rudolf Steiner bookshop in London opposite the British Museum years ago, when I first came to London in the 80s, and read Steiner's lectures on Goethe. And then I worked at the Steiner Library in the anthroposophical headquarters and learned some German and used to read Steiner's views on Goethe, because of course you probably know that Steiner became an archivist studying Goethe's scientific writings particularly. And Steiner did a PhD at the University of Rostock, where a friend of mine is now living. And although I don't agree with everything Steiner wrote, I'm a critical anthroposophist, I do believe in the spirit behind his work, and I think we have to take that forward. This idea that we can use our intelligence, our our intellect, our critical reason, in a spiritual way. What Steiner was trying to do was bridge between the scientific world and the spiritual world through the correct use of right reason and ultimately to seership. Now, Steiner was greatly inspired by the Druids, and he gave some lectures about Druids, which are still impressive. He was way ahead of his time. And as I say, although he got things wrong, it doesn't mean that what he was trying to do was wrong. His aim was right. But he was working 100 years ago. There was much less known about both science and also comparative religion. He didn't have access to a lot of the periodic table of the religions and philosophies that I've compiled. He didn't know about. It wasn't available. And even less so in Goethe's time, who lived like 100 years even before Steiner. But each generation of poets and thinkers has to do what they can with the materials that we have. We inherit the workshop of our forebears. I mean, Shakespeare didn't have access to a tenth of what we now know about science and spirituality and comparative religion. But from the little he had access to, he forged, cosmically important works. And the same with Goethe. I just want to quote this short passage which is about poetry. I'm going to read it in English. But since the end of all poetic art is the improvement of the reader's mind, or so we're told, my verses for their part shall point the usual moral of their kind. This life's a crazy journey, and our heart may stumble. But two mighty powers, we'll find, can move the world and help us as we go. To duty, much. To love, far more we owe. Goethe was a great lover, and he wrote also some wonderful poems when he visited Italy, which were quite, erotic and rather wonderful in there. He was a great lover of life, a lover of women, a lover of romance, as all poets should be. I'm reading a biography of Proust at the moment, who was an amazing French novelist who took the novel to new heights of introspective analysis. My mother was a great Proustian scholar and lover, and I didn't at the time of her life appreciate Proust properly, and only after she was dead did I read Proust and properly appreciate, his complexity and his sophistication. I'm reading this famous biography, which is said by Philip Toynbee to be one of the great English biographies of any time. And it's an amazing construction of Proust's life set against the fictionalized version he put in his novel, because his great novel, it was one long sequence, a kind of drawn on autobiographical data. Proust's masterpiece À la recherche du temps perdu is unique among great novels in that it is not, properly speaking, a fiction, but a creative autobiography, a work of imagination interpreting reality, in which the characters, events and places are drawn entirely from his own experience. It's an extraordinary conceit, really, to write the novel about your life, in which you can tell everything how you want it and then jumble everything up. You can change the places, you can alter the names, you can compound 2 or 3 characters into one. And he himself, as